Without further ado, I am so excited to introduce Susan Conley tonight to discuss Landslide with us. Susan is going to be in conversation tonight with Monica Wood, author of Ernie's Arc, and Meredith Hall, author of Beneficence. So Susan Conley is the author of many books, including the novels Elsie Come Home and Paris Was the Place, and the memoir The Foremost Good Fortune. Her work has been published in the New York Times and many other places. She currently teaches in the Stone Coast MFA program at the University of Southern Maine, and she is the co-founder of The Telling Room, a creative writing lab serving thousands of Maine kids every year, which just sounds amazing. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. And we also have with us tonight Monica Wood. Monica is a novelist, memoirist, and playwright. Her novel, The One in a Million Boy, has been translated into 20 languages in over 30 countries. And she just recently published a book called Ernie's Arc in September of last year. And last but not least, we have Meredith Hall with us tonight. Her memoir, Without a Map, was instantly recognized as a classic of the genre and became a New York Times bestseller. It was named a Best Book of the Year by Kirkus and Booksense and was an Elle Magazine Reader's Pick of the Year. Her most recent book, published in October of last year, is Beneficence. So we have a highly accomplished panel with us tonight, and I'm very excited about the conversation. I haven't finished Landslide yet, but I'm about halfway through, and I love it so much. I love Jill. The character is just amazing. I wish I could just text her and ask her if I could bring her dinner, because I feel like she just needs some extra help. But anyways, so Susan, Monica, and Meredith are going to speak tonight for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to those audience questions. So you're tired of hearing from me. I'm going to turn it over to them, and you'll see me again at the end.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Much. Hi, Monica.
Hi.
Hi,
Meredith.
Hello.
So thank you for coming. I feel like we're having tea. I thought this would be fun because when I was thinking about this book tour of mine, I felt like of the two women, writers who happen to be women who are friends of mine, who I think of as really, really writing about place, and most recently with the new release of Ernie's Arc and with Meredith's new beautiful novel, like really mining Maine.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought we could have a conversation about that. And maybe first we could talk about questions or how you approached place and Maine in your work. And if you ask a question or how your relationship to place kind of evolved in the writing. And maybe it's the writing across all of your work, not just those books.
Wow, there used to be this big kerfuffle about this was way back in the day, about who had the right to call themselves a Maine writer, if you came from somewhere else, or if you weren't born here, or if you weren't here for 7 generations or whatever. And as the token born here, I was frequently asked to kind of referee these things, and it just started to feel really absurd to me. You write where you write, and you land where you land. Almost every single thing I've ever written is set in Maine, because that's been my home my entire life, except I went away for college and came back. But I know a lot of writers who write beautifully about Maine who did not grow up here. I think it's just that it's that creative spark that you get. We all get them in different places, and for me, place is really important because I'm so drenched in place and have been for my whole life. And I think we write about different aspects of Maine, because we're from different places in Maine.
Yeah, it's very interesting. These books, it occurred to me that Susan has written about the coastal life and the fishing world at a time of great transition, really at a moment of change. And Monica, you have written so deeply and beautifully about the life of mill towns and people employed by these mills, both supported by them and also the costs of that life in those communities, also at a time of transition as those mills started going under. And my novel Beneficence is about farming life in Maine, this dairy farm. And I am catching that story just before that moment when things start to fall apart for Maine farmers. It really caught my attention that all three of these worlds of Maine actually are very fragile places. They are.
That is so interesting because,
yeah.
But I wonder, so is it really place that draws us, or the notion of transition, which seems to be the bailiwick of writers? You don't write about stability, you write about instability.
Right. And Susan's story in Landslide, Susan, you are very explicit. You actually educate the reader about what the challenges are for the fishing communities, and what the frustrations are with the bureaucracy, and the terrible decision-making that happens that affects the livelihoods of these people as fishing becomes more and more corporate. And you actually take the time to teach us about that transitional moment, and why this catastrophe in Kit's personal life is sort of being carried along by this larger catastrophe that's happening in the fishing community.
Yeah, that takes us into questions around craft, right? And how much to tell, because that could get boring really fast. I was very aware of that. I mean, I had pages and pages of research about fishing sectors and quotas and permits.
Yeah.
And really, for me, I will say, when I asked that question a little bit rhetorically, like, do you ask a question about your work and about place? Because I was asking, first of all, can Maine survive without the commercial fishing? Like, what will Maine be, and how will that change look? What will that look like? And for me to do that, I had to talk about the real problems, the real stuff, and not lose the reader, right?
Right. Yeah, I've never read a good novel about permits.
Right. Well, and especially readers from outside Maine have a kind of heroized understanding of the fishing world, and it might surprise people that it's in such a time of industrialization and transition. So I think that was a necessary. You had to catch us up to what the circumstances were for those characters. Monica was so deeply inside the mill work. We watched from the moment when we were the Kennedys, I think it's the first line, Monica, that you say, your father died, and he worked in that mill and he died. We open there. And then what you do is carry us home. You actually walk room to room in this place that is home to this family, and it's so, that mill life is so much a part of literally the kitchen table, it's so much a part of that indoor life. And so there isn't the explicit teaching, but you're actually showing us by just the routines of the day, who the neighbors are, this immigrant community that lives so closely around these mills. And you sort of bring us inside that home and then walk us outside around the neighborhood. And that's the way you educate us about that life.
Well, because it all comes down to character, right? And I'm thinking, in Susan's new book, and really in all of ours, there's some industry or something that creates the grand background, but people aren't interested, they're interested in how that has an impact on the families involved.
Right.
And there's usually, I think in all of our books, there's a mirror image of the transition or trouble in the industry and the transition and trouble in the family, mill life, farm life, fishing life. It's so interesting. Meredith, you're so smart. Of course you came up with that.
Well, actually in Beneficence, this farm is in its heyday. This farm is really, we're catching this story when Tup, the father and husband in this family, is confident that he can make a living from this farm. And the farm is very benevolent. The farm is very productive. It's very beautiful. And the family understands this kind of critical relationship between themselves and the land, and the requirement of hard work that they put into this land and what this land will give to them in return. And it's never suggested in this book that this is going to come by. This book moves from the late 40s into the early 60s. And by the late 60s, that transition is starting to happen where we start losing Maine's farms. But that's really not even suggested in this book. I caught this.
But what happens, but in your book, it's, and you're right, the farm is beautiful, the family is beautiful, and we live quite a while in that beauty, the beauty of this family who loves their farm and the farm loves them. And then there's this unspeakable tragedy that happens that then changes the farm in, given its druthers, is just moving along and all fine and good. But because the family has changed so profoundly and their feeling about the farm and the farm's feeling about them, everything gets tipped.
Yes, right.
And it's so beautiful. And I think in Susan's book, there's a kind of an extrication that's trying to happen, with Jill, when this thing happens to her husband, he's injured. And suddenly she's, if you'll excuse the pun, she's at sea. She's the one at sea, trying to figure out, she's got these two boys, and one of whom especially is suffering greatly from his own tragedies. And so there's a way that I think your family is pulling away from the thing that has given them family. And Susan, your family is pulling away from the thing that, or your protagonist anyway, is pulling away from the thing that has given her family. But I think in my work, especially this in Ernie's arc, which is about several families going through the chronology of a terrible mill strike, it's like the mill is pulling away from them.
Yes.
And it leaves them quite fractured.
Yes, that's right.
There's so many similarities. It's amazing.
I know, it's funny. I was doing a talk with, we could have had a fourth person here, and it would have been Carrie Arsenal.
Yeah.
Middletown, which I'm sure we've read, and Carrie and I did an event last week, and we realized that we were, in a way, her book is a memoir. And it really looks at Rumford, at the Middletown that she grew up in, which must have, I know you and Carrie have done events, Monica, and I can't imagine the echoes with Ernie's.
We grew up 1 mile from each other,
That's
same town. I was in Mexico, she was in Rumford, it's the same town. Yeah.
But she was saying how when she was growing up, so I grew up in this sort of mid-coast fishing world that I render in Landslide.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not from fishing, but I'm fourth generation of that town.
Yeah.
And my world is fishing, like my father's world is fishing, but all like around us, beloved people in our lives, but not in my actual family. Mm-hmm. But Carrie was saying how when she was growing up, the idea was that the coast was rich, right?
Right.
And all the money was on the coast. And meanwhile, the people that were like struggling in these fishing villages never, ever once thought that they were rich, right? Yeah, this was all these sort of different impressions. And then when we were talking, we realized, just like Meredith said, we were essentially writing about the same thing.
Yeah.
That transition time. Susan, it interested me because even the housing that you present, there's Kit and Jill live in this A-frame on this island that is just a short hop from the shore. They skip back and forth in the skiff. And yet there's something so insubstantial about that A-frame. And then if they are going to finally find solid winter housing, they actually go to live with Kit's father. It's still, this family of two teenage boys does not really have solid housing of their own. And I thought that was a wonderful way to set up the fragility that we start to see happening with Kit in this hospital, a distance away, and really on his own to imagine whatever is going to come. Is he ever going to be able to return to his fishing life? And I loved the way that these two A-frame houses, they seem so quirky and so specific, and yet neither really provides a home for this family.
That's really interesting, Meredith. It's God, I hadn't thought of it that way, but I wanted that house on the island to feel very wobbly, not a house you're supposed to be in through November.
That's right.
And Maine is so much the home for Kit, the husband and the fisherman in this story, but it's a place that Jill has left, and who knows, the family may have to leave again. I mean, this is something that I was fascinated with growing up, and Landslide's not an autobiographical novel per se, but there's so much emotional truth, right, that we bring to our fiction. And this idea of leaving Maine comes up a lot in the book, and it came up a lot for me when I was growing up, and it had really not so much to do with class. It really had to do with like longing. And if I knew people that were going to leave the state come hell or high water when I was growing up, right?
Right.
And this has come up a lot in the last few weeks. Like, Maine might be the only state like this. Like, no one I talk to in Michigan or Florida is like, everyone's obsessed with staying or going, but in Maine we really are. Or certainly the characters in Landslide are, and that rings true for you too, Monica.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of states like that. I think any state with a lot of, I'm wondering if we could get 3 writers from another state somewhere, like Colorado, say, just picking one out of the air, who would have had these connections in their books, the idea of an industry. And, we were anyway, a manufacturing state, in the sense of, if you think of fishing as in some way a manufacturing industry, it's an industry.
Right.
Farming is an industry of that ilk. When we don't, we're not a banking state. We're not a financial center. We're not any of those types of things that you'd find in some other places. So, maybe that is the American story, and that there are more states like that than we know. But I do find it really interesting. And it doesn't have to be the 3 of us. It could have been 3 other writers from Maine. And I think there would have been or from New England too. You have to include New England in that, I think. It's not just Maine. I mean, New England's a very, very, there are mill towns all up and down New England. There's fishing all along the coast, all the way. There's farming, we speak from Maine, but we're New Englanders, to broaden it out.
Yes. I've been asked many times since this novel came out, how did I know this farming life if I hadn't grown up on a Maine farm? And I've given it a lot of thought. There's an odd story. I was estranged from my father, but I understand that he was doing genealogy work. I grew up in New Hampshire, and my parents were divorced. He was in New Hampshire, and he was doing genealogical work and looking for some tribal records for a Native American grandmother. And nobody in our family knew anything beyond parents, no stories even of grandparents. We didn't know who anybody was. And in that search, he happened one day to come across an old farmhouse on the shore in Jonesport. And on the spot, he and his wife bought it. And it turns out that his cousin lived at that time in Jonesport. And he actually showed my father's grandparents' burial places in Jonesport. He happened to walk into a little town and say, oh, I need to belong here, and bought this house, and within a few days found that this is actually where his family was. And through that, I discovered that my family are all Maine. They were very poor Maine farmers. They came down through the Maritimes looking for a better time, farmed in Maine for a couple generations, and ended up in the mills in Massachusetts trying to make a living. But this is I think our knowledge, Susan, you were talking about not actually having grown up in a fishing family, but how familiar this world is to you. I think we somehow carry this sense of the people and the place inside us. And it's wonderful to be able to imagine the individual lives of our characters, but somehow there's something very known about that world.
Yeah, I could not believe after I read Beneficence that you had not grown up on a farm like that.
No, I did not.
It was so utterly convincing.
Yes. Well, Susan has done this with you certainly know that mill life Monica, but Susan has done this with the fishing, you know.
That's true. Yeah.
Her husband is not a fisherman, and yet she's
Yeah.
understood especially the tension. Jill is a documentary filmmaker. They are really,
Right.
this is a couple with built-in tension in this place. There's an inherent tension in that relationship because we know that she is not, she was not born to the life that she's chosen through marriage.
Yeah, and the other thing about moving away from territory for a minute, and more thematic stuff, is I find in all of your books, Susan, there's always some kind of a tension between making art and making family.
Yes.
I see that as a big theme in your work throughout.
And your courage, Susan, in your courage in allowing us to see the reluctance that the women have to commit themselves fully as mothers and as wives. There's such a reluctance to hand themselves over completely to those roles. And I think you're very brave in showing us what the cost is of the decisions that those women make.
I would put that in a slightly different way, Meredith. Just looking back to the last two books, including the memoir, not so much a reluctance as a regretful understanding of what it is you're giving over.
Yes.
You know, it's not so much, it's wanting two things that you can't have simultaneously and understanding that. Right. Which is really messy and complicated.
And the perpetual sense of failure that these women carry because of it.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that Jill in Landslide is she's in a little bit more control than she may appear to be at times with her wolves, with her two teenage sons. I mean, she knows the ways that she will navigate them to make that contact and that connection, and she uses humor a lot to reach them. It's funny, I did a talk a while ago with a radio show in which the woman asking me questions she had really enjoyed the book, and she was convinced that Jill had been like really sort of sublimated, like disempowered by the wolves, and had lost her voice, wasn't seen by them. And I sort of, I said, I actually think she's just playing them. I think that this is the moment in teenagehood where these things have to be navigated in this way. I'm not sure she'd given up as much power at all as she may have at times. So that was really.
And what about then, Susan, her negotiations in her relationship with Kit, as she decides to stay at home with the boys, and that kind of nagging guilt that she has, and that guilt slowly turns into anger as she decides that she is not going to go and play the wife at the injured husband's bedside,
Right. Yeah. I mean, the beauty of her life is, on a good day, is that the wolves are in school. I think her choices were made, her bigger choices were made when she decided that she would live on that island. And I've grown up staring at those islands and wondering, I mean, in a way, the novel is born of my curiosity of what it would be like to be out there with no other people, right? Just the wolves and the husband is gone fishing a great deal of time. And I also wondered, how does any mother, but how does she hold on to that connection with the boys? How does she not actually physically or emotionally lose the boys? And then I let Maine, and I'm so curious what you two think about this in your work. Like, I wanted to celebrate it. I wanted to be nostalgic about the Maine I grew up in the 70s and the Fleetwood Mac song. And then I wanted to see, like, would Maine hold them? Sam, the younger boy, he just wants to fish. Will he be able to? Will Maine, will there be any fishing? Like, will Maine hold them? I was asking that. Yeah. And I think about Ernie, going to get his, waiting in line. It's like he's not, is he getting unemployment during the strike? I guess he's getting unemployment. And then he starts to build the arc and he's angry. He's really angry. And I wondered, Monica, like if it was an explicit question you were asking when you started him on the journey, or were you just like letting the camera roll?
Yeah, I never have a plan. No idea. No. Yeah. I think you guys write the same way, don't you? Just sort of following your language into the story. Yeah. I mean, I really wish I could be one of those writers who outline everything and then you just write the book, but
I'm glad you're not, Monica.
You're well, just one book like that. One book. That's all I ask.
It sounds so much easier, doesn't it?
Oh my God, it just sounds like heaven.
Do you know, when I close down my computer at the end of my writing day, I've developed a habit of leaving mid-paragraph. I walk out of it in the middle of a paragraph, because when I return in the morning, I'm not deciding what's going to happen next. I'm still in that moment, and anything can happen next. I haven't pre-decided that when I sit down in the morning.
You know, that's an old Hemingway trick.
No, I didn't know that.
Hemingway did that.
That's so good.
Yeah.
I like this.
Mm-hmm.
I like this.
Yeah.
So I have this phrase, emotional curiosity, where I do actually think that works for me. This idea of when I say the nostalgia, I really do mean it for the 70s and for this Maine that I knew, and this Maine that I think is being forgotten or isn't being seen, and it's not very far away, it's still there. But, this moment, there's a moment when Jill in Landslide meets this man coming out of the first screening of her first little documentary. She makes these short documentaries, and he says, Maine, it's the only place left. Like Montana's ruined, California's ruined, Idaho ruined, but we still have Maine, right? And it's so safe. And then she has a response to him. And that actually really did happen to me. That, not surprisingly, perhaps, that conversation got airlifted in. And that was definitely at some, that was a seed that I really wanted to plant and really explore. Like what can I shine a light on in Maine, and like really celebrate in all its hardness. And I didn't know exactly how, like you're saying, Monica, I didn't know how. I had some teenagers, I had a fishing trawler, but I definitely had an emotional curiosity. Yeah.
Do you know, I was married for many years to an offshore fisherman. I raised my children in East Boothbay. And I thought that you caught very well this kind of dual world that the fishermen live in. That is, my husband was gone all the time. He was away far more than he was home, and home very unpredictably. All of a sudden be home for 24 hours, gone for 3 weeks, home for 3 days, gone for 2 weeks. And I thought that you caught two things very well. One is the role that Jill has to play with her children. She has been mother and father to these children, and yet she needs to be able to hand that over, the role of father, over to her husband the minute he walks in the door again. Tricky territory that I think you really latched onto. And the other thing is sort of this idea that you're talking about, this perennial optimism that this world is going to go on forever, that fishing has been so central to these families. It was unimaginable to me. My husband did pair trawling, a long way offshore for many, many, many years. And it was, I don't believe that any of the men involved, even though they had to go to bigger and bigger and bigger boats to compete with the corporate fishermen, I don't think any of them really believed that the end was in sight. And I think you caught that really well, that this is, even people from away have such faith that fishing world is going to stay forever. Yeah. That it's going to define Maine forever.
Yeah, that's so well said. Meredith, you and I have had a lot of conversations and we have never had that one. I didn't, how did I miss this part where you're raising these boys with your husband on the commercial boat? Like that, you're my dream reader. I should have been consulting with you. I should have been consulting with you. This is kind of amazing. That's it.
I owned a trawler in Gloucester, Massachusetts with a long-term boyfriend for 5 or 6 years. And then that relationship ended and I came back to Maine and married a fisherman. What else would I do, right?
What else?
But what strikes me, the way you describe it, it's really more like, it's like being married to it's like being a military wife.
It is, except that there is a kind of romantic ideal about the fishermen, that those wives are really, it is imperative that the wives absorb that sense of the ideal. Somehow this is heroic, this is heroic work. And if you feel that it's difficult to raise a family on your own and figure out how to fix the hot water heater when it blows up, that's, don't forget, your husband is doing heroic work. It's really built into generations of very male work. It's such a masculine world.
Yeah.
Interesting. When I did interviews for this book and I talked to a number of fishermen, and some of them I had not met, and I traveled around the state. Some of them were very close to me and my family. But this idea that fishing would never end, Meredith, it was in the room with us. And sometimes I would get right up to the question, because the question was just begging to be asked, right? They were going farther and further out. They were catching less and less fish. But I realized I couldn't ask it. We couldn't get there.
Right.
And I will say, as you both probably know, I mean, there's a lot of good things happening to create a more sustainable Gulf of Maine fishery. And there's a lot of hope, even though it couldn't be a harder time. So that's been really, really interesting for me to learn a lot more about too. And I went in, with the idea that it's a story of no fish. It's a story of overfishing. It's simple.
Right.
And it's much more complicated than that.
Right.
There are stocks of fish, but the industry has been so decimated that there's no infrastructure and so on. So, and then, the other thing that really was compelling me about this book was the fishing village that I grew up near. It's a tourist town now. I mean, that is what it is. Like every fisherman's house has been flipped, but that is not the case in a lot of thriving lobster villages.
The lobster villages are holding on, I think. It still is a joy to wander along the really, those little tips of all those peninsulas. Those lobstering communities are still managing. So,
I don't know how they are. I don't know how they're managing because of all the flipped houses and the real estate gone completely insane.
Yes.
In Maine. I don't know how they're doing it, honestly.
Yes. Right. Unless they live in villages where their property taxes are protected. I know some villages are adjusting taxes as a way to value the fishing people, but not.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I don't think many villages are doing that. Yeah. Monica, something Susan said reminded me of your work too. It feels in these mill stories that you tell that even as real catastrophe is starting to approach the entire manufacturing world, these people are so reluctant to believe that this is going to come to a halt. And when it does, it doesn't peter out, it just collapses. There's such a faith that the way these families have lived is going to continue.
Well, because it's not just the way they've lived, these industries create community. The industry came first, and the community came as a result of. And it is really a big difference between, say, a bedroom community of a city. Because people moved out there to be there, but they work somewhere else, and it's, they've got their things. is a huge difference between that and a community that comes from an industry.
And you actually demonstrate that the kind of geography of the town
Mhm.
is always centered around the mill.
Yeah,
Right.
always.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It brings-
both physically and emotionally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but emotionally, and it gets at these issues of or questions of belonging
Mhm.
that I think are circulating through all of our work. Belonging in the family structure.
Mhm.
I mean, and then belonging to the land. You
Mhm.
know, when I think about Beneficence and how much they believe for a while that the land is sort of part of them and they are part of the land. And although there's such a sense, you do such a good job, Meredith, of having Dodie and the family know at times that it could all go. Like there's a sense of knowing you create this tension, such good tension before disaster hits. But
Mhm.
that idea of belonging, I really am very interested in that. And in Maine, how you can belong to certain places in Maine, but you're not, like Jill is actually from a mill town. And I did that very intentionally so that she would not feel like she belongs in the fishing village.
Yeah, that was clear
Right.
'Cause
and very
wasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And she wouldn't belong in the mill. Kid doesn't belong in the mill town. I mean, he can visit, sure.
right.
But these things fascinate me, these subtle little, orbits and who belongs and who doesn't.
Mhm.
They really fascinate me.
Yeah, one difference I'm looking at now too between my mill work and your fishing work and Meredith's novel is that in some ways the land is betraying the people.
Yes. Yes.
But and when I started reading Beneficence, I thought it was going to be a story about the farm betraying the family. And the farm is the only thing that remains steady.
Yes. Right.
And I loved that reversal of expectations so much.
It is the farm which actually allows, the farm is so steadfast that eventually it gives these people enough time to find their way back to each
Yeah,
other.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So well said.
Well, Stephanie's back. Hi, Stephanie.
Yes, hi. I actually hate to interrupt this conversation because it's so good. And I have so enjoyed everything you've had to say. And so just a little bit about me. I just moved to Rhode Island from Alabama.
Oh my gosh.
So it's a big transplant. And, my husband and I, we lived here briefly back into 2017. And we moved back to Alabama, and then now we've returned to Rhode Island. And honestly, one of the things, and I was just telling a neighbor of ours this just last night at dinner, which is so odd. But one of the things that really attracts me to New England is this deep sense of place, and that runs through all of these small communities. We live in a very small town in kind of southeastern Rhode Island, and it's something that I almost at times I'm jealous of, because being from Alabama, my family, we're not originally from the South. And so my family's moved all over the place, and we've never had that kind of long line of, I can trace my family back to this plot of land, and I really appreciate that about New England culture. So I have a couple of questions for all of you. I am curious if, I know that it's very easy to romanticize life on the coast. I know that I've been guilty of it before. It's very easy to romanticize the lifestyle in community, fishing communities and, mill communities, kind of those small town New England towns. Does that frustrate you? Is that why these places feature so strongly in each of your books, to kind of correct that romantic idealized vision, or what? I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
I never think of it as a corrective at all, because people's experience of Maine when they come here on vacation, or we want them to like it here. We want their money, and we want them to love Maine. And
Yeah.
You know, I always go out of my way to be nice to tourists, even when they're clogging the streets of Portland
Traffic.
in the middle of the summer. But I think it's more of just, it's not so much a corrective as a revelation, just adding another color to what people think of as the state of Maine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, Stephanie, it occurs to me that I think a lot of people love living in New England because so many Americans do not have a sense of rootedness and do not have a sense that a place and its people have had a kind of continuity. And I think it's very comforting. People move to Rhode Island or Vermont or Maine, and even I think they're sort of apologetic, well, I'm not from here, but it feels very, very good to settle among people who have such a profound sense of belonging in that place. Yeah. And I think people moving into New England feel that vicariously. And Longport, I think the longing is very profound.
Absolutely. I think for me, it's a sense of groundedness. I find that here for me personally. I know that's not for everybody, but I definitely, I think I find that here.
Well, welcome to New England.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
That's just great.
Thank you. We're still adjusting to the winter and the amount of snow that we've had, but we've enjoyed it so far. I just finished reading, towards the end of last year, I read a book by a young lady called, her book is called Dark Salt Clear, and the author's name is Lamorna Ash. I wonder if any of you have ever heard of that.
I'm writing it down.
Oh,
I like the title.
One of my favorite books that came out last year. Actually, I think it was published in the US maybe in February. So it's relatively new. It's a memoir of her time. She's from Cornwall, lived in London and then returns to Cornwall after some time away, and just really wants to explore the communities there, specifically the fishing villages in Cornwall. And I just think she does such a great job of really getting to know the communities and forming relationships with fishermen. And she goes out on trawlers and, boats for weeks at a time with these people.
Wow.
And it's just such a fantastic book. And a lot of what you were talking about just reminded me of that. I wonder if any of you have ever explored other fishing communities, specifically Cornwall or, Ireland, any communities in Ireland or on the West Coast, just for comparison.
Sorry, Susan.
Oh, no, I have spent time in Ireland in fishing communities, and yeah, lots of them. I mean, maybe because I'm coastal, I'm always drawn to the coast and to other fishing communities. It's true. Lots and lots of places, actually. Maybe that's part of the longing. I don't know, having grown up watching those trawlers come and go up in the mid-coast, I am fascinated by them. And I love it when we still see a fleet in the harbor. You do see more the further north you go. That was my experience this year, and all kinds of ingenious ways that the wharves are hanging on, right? Or thriving. Actually, a lot of them are actually thriving. But yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. Ireland.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time camping over probably 10 years in Newfoundland. And
oh, wow.
I was fascinated. I would go up early in the summer, late spring each year and spend a month roaming around and camping. And I was struck that what I was seeing really was, in many ways, I was there just at the time that the cod fishery was collapsing. And it's a study in governmental mismanagement and really, I think, corruption. And it destroyed the communities and really destroyed these little tiny communities that had not even had roads connecting them until 1965.
Oh, wow.
If you can imagine. Everything was, they were called outports, and they went outport to outport by boat. And so I have been very interested in watching how a fishing world, Newfoundland is fishing. What happens to Newfoundland when the fishing dies? And I've become very excited about a writer named Michael Crummy, Crummy, who writes about that world just achingly. It is aching storytelling. And the best of the books that I've read is called Sweetland, but it's a beautiful, beautiful study of island living. And it's.
I'm going to write that down, and I'll drop that in the chat for anybody interested. What was the name of the book?
Sweetland. Sweetland.
Great.
Monica, do you want to share a little bit about what you're working on now, or too early, or too?
No, it's I'm working on a new novel. To my big surprise, COVID is the reason. I mean, I had literally nothing else on the calendar. I mean, every single thing for as far as the eye could see was canceled. So I just started fiddling around with something, and I wrote a first draft in a year, which is turbocharged time for me.
Wow.
And now I'm about 3/4 through a pretty solid second draft.
Great.
And I wrote it very differently from how I usually write. I went right from beginning to end, and I never, ever, ever do that. I go back, and then I go back, and I go back. And I find that I'm doing that process now, but it's so much more, or so much less panic making, because I know I do have a whole story. It's just all in the wrong order right now, and all kinds of other problems. But it's kind of gotten me through this horrible year.
And are you working, Monica, in that familiar world of mill life? And
No, this is very different. I mean, you can tell I wrote it, but it actually takes place in Portland, and it has 3 characters that I'm completely falling in love with. And one is a young woman named Violet Powell, who has just gotten out of prison after 2 years for vehicular manslaughter. And Harriet, who is a woman who does a book group in the prison, which is how she knows Violet. And Frank, who's a retired machinist, who is the widower of the woman Violet killed in the accident. So, like all my work, it's about creating family out of broken pieces.
Yes, great.
So that's what I'm working on.
Yeah, that sounds excellent.
It's exciting.
It is exciting. It's very exciting. I'm also working on another play. So in fact, I've had 2 plays produced, as you guys know, but I actually never studied playwriting. And so I'm taking a playwriting class on Wednesday nights. And one of the teachers is somebody who was in one of my plays. But, and he said, "Why are you in my class?" I said, "I've never studied it formally." And he's also a great playwright, by the way. But the other thing, it is so much fun to not be the teacher, because I've done a million workshops, and to not be the teacher it's just exquisitely fun. And the other thing is, you really cannot hear the fundamentals too many times, I think. So, I mean, I've done lots of workshops, writing workshops with very accomplished people in them, and it never bothers me at all, because I think, you can't hear this stuff too many times.
So true.
It's almost like rereading a book later on in life. You're going to get something different from it.
Yeah.
So true, isn't it? You just come to it with a different life.
Before we wrap up, I always love to ask our authors just about what they're reading right now. So what's on your nightstand right now?
I just finished A Gentleman in Moscow.
Yeah.
And it'd been recommended to me so often over the last couple of years, and I finally read it, and it is wonderful. It's one of my favorite books ever. It's very slow moving, which is the big complaint about it, but you have to just read it in the right frame of mind. I think it's a great winter book.
Yeah.
And I read it slower than I normally read. I'm a kind of a fast reader, but this one, I just immersed myself in the life of this Russian hotel, this guy who's on house arrest for 30 years in a Russian hotel.
Do you feel like COVID has affected the way you've read that book? Just knowing that he's kind of stuck in this hotel, and I wonder if that
sense, but the fact that I didn't have really anything else to do, so I'm reading more. I think it affected it that way, but yeah.
Great.
But it was wonderful. I really, really enjoyed it. And another one I just reread is called, you guys have to read this book. There's so much insider writer stuff in it, but it's called How I Became a Famous Novelist. It's hilarious.
Good. Okay.
It is hilarious.
Oh, good. Oh, good. I've been reading, I just finished Brian Washington's Memorial. And Brian Washington, beautiful food and culture essayist at the New Yorker. And he's out of Houston. And this book is a just exquisite novel about his love affair with a Japanese man. Well, not his, the protagonist, although so much of Brian Washington's life is in this novel. And it's just so good on food and love and belonging. And so that was my treat. That was sort of my December treat. I knew it was going to be good. I'd been teaching his essays for a while.
Oh, nice.
And then I just started reading. Have either of you read Red, White, and Blue? It's a spy novel by Leah Carpenter. It's so good. It's this very taut espionage novel written by a woman, and in a woman's voice. And so this is my this is sort of like what I'm doing at night to try to unwind to Monica. It's like, so I want to recommend that book. It's been out for a little while, lots of acclaim, and I kind of stumbled my way to it. So
it's called Red, White, and Blue.
Yeah, Red, White, and Blue.
And it's well written. I mean, the writing is
very, very. It's an interior spy. The Leah Carpenter turns out is like was like a securities espionage expert. Started this, so it's the anti-male spy novel.
Yeah,
it's like really.
That sounds like fun. That sounds really fun.
It does.
Well, and I just actually finished reading Landslide.
Oh, really?
I wanted to read Landslide before our conversation. And I have a habit of moving from from fiction to nonfiction. And so I picked up a book by a Maine writer, actually, Sandel Morse, who has been, you know, Sandel, she's been in a couple of my writing workshops. And she has a new book out. It might be her first book. I'm not certain about that. It's called The Spiral Shell. And it actually is about her being awarded a writing residency in a small village in southern France. And while she's there, she ends up going back 5 times. And while she's there, she becomes very interested in her own Jewish identity and the history of the resistance movement and the Vichy government in France and the Shoah, and trying to get local people to talk to her about what happened in this village, and nobody wants to talk all these decades later.
Wow.
So it's a memoir, but there are 2 story threads as she starts really articulating her own sense of her Jewishness and who she might have been in that time if she had been faced with those challenges.
Wow, that sounds good.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Those all sound great. Yeah. Everyone's got such great taste. Excellent. Well, this has been such an enjoyable conversation. I know I've appreciated it as a non-New Englander. Helen would like to know, Meredith, what that book was that you just mentioned. You said
Sandel Morse, The Spiral Shell.
Okay, great. Okay. All right. Well, I think we are all out of time for tonight. Thank you,
Stephanie,
so much to all 3 of you and to everybody watching.
The fastest hour.
That was, I know, I wish I could have let you go longer. That was, I really enjoyed hearing everything you had to say. And I just popped the links to each of your books in the chat for anybody interested in purchasing those.
Thank you.
And hopefully everybody was able to get those recommendations down. If you missed a recommendation and you need to go back and find it, you can always go to Facebook. This has been streaming live on Facebook, and the recording will still be available afterwards. So thank you so much to everybody, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Meredith.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody.
Bye-bye.